Okay, this episode is about who is the greatest mind in the modern era post Constantine who has taken the position that Paul is an illegitimate source of valid Christian teachings. Let's put it that way. For a variety of reasons, either he's a false apostle, or he wasn't a true follower of Jesus Christ, or there's something wrong in his story, or he's just a great corrupter. These are the different theories that one of more of these individuals have relied upon. And so these are truly great minds. Leo Tolstoy, who was a Christian, Soren Kierkegaard, who was a Lutheran by training, Jeremy Bentham, who was agnostic, and Thomas Jefferson, who was a deist moralist. And I mean, these are truly great minds of history, will go down in history as great minds. And they each had adopted anti-Paulinism. They each rejected Paul as a valid voice. And I want to talk about which of the four is the greatest. Now, there are a lot of competitors I've put to the sidelines, and it's not that they're not valid voices, but sometimes there are certain people who are just different, and the way they think is so unique, and they see things that other people can't see. That it's very interesting to see what they could see, and then you can see more through their eyes because they are very insightful people. Um, and I don't believe I'm an insightful person. People compliment me sometimes, and I just want to tell you is if I have any insight, it's usually because I'm reading these people. So then you think I'm very insightful. But I think insightfulness and genius is really something that you have to be born with. And I've met people like this that are really wonderful people, and they just have this unbelievable insight into things. And I just wish I had that. So I'm going to suggest that we learn and focus on the kind of messages that people like these four in particular, give us. Now we're going to study people who are more into the citation method of dealing with Paul, with the Bible verses and this and that and the other thing. But you're going to see something that's a bigger picture type view of Paul that is just useful to keep in your repertoire. And I'm going to vote for, of the top of these, Leo Tolstoy. And I put him at the top for that reason. And I think Soren Kierkegaard would be number two, and Jeremy Bentham number three, although he's an agnostic. But his sympathy for Christ is actually kind of warms me up to him, because he really loves Jesus' message, and he wants it protected. He knows there's something special. I think he wishes he could believe in God the way Christians do, but he loves Jesus. He loves the messages of Jesus Christ. And so he's more Christian than some Christians, because of that, unfortunately. And then there's Thomas Jefferson. He's a special, unique case. Brilliant mind, brilliant mind. He actually took the time to make a Jesus words only Bible, where he just wanted the teachings of Jesus, didn't need any miracles in them. So he's known for having reduced the miracles and maybe even eliminated them entirely. I'm not sure that that's true, but he believed Paul was the great corrupter. So I mean, you've got four geniuses here, four amazing minds, and the top mind is Leo Tolstoy. So I want to share with you tonight some of the ways that Leo Tolstoy looked at things and how he grasped things that sent me on paths that I then went, okay, I got to go check and see what he knows that I don't know. And that's why I just love Leo Tolstoy. Well, also, as an author, I love his writings. Anna Karenina, fantastic book. There's a lot of spiritual messages in there. People who were, he always has a religious figure, a Christian, who is a good Christian, who's trying to raise questions to people to make them think, and who are thinking. So it's open theology, meaning it's not a priest. It's somebody who's a regular person who's questioning things and asks the right questions. All right, so let's go take a look at Leo Tolstoy, and I think you'll enjoy this. So I have an article at our web page on Tolstoy. It's called Tolstoy on Paulinism, and now he makes remarks about Paul throughout his writings, so it's not limited to the book My Religion, but his book My Religion, he's very he's more detailed. Let's put it that way. This is 1884. And Tolstoy explains that Christianity went off the rails initially with Paul, who knew nothing of Jesus' ethical teachings. And this is what he said: the separation between the doctrine of life and the explanation of life began with the preaching of Paul, who knew not the ethical teachings set forth in the Gospel of Matthew, and who preached a metaphysico-Kabbalistic theory. So Paul teaches a metaphysico-Kabbalistic theory entirely foreign to Christ. And this separation was perfected in the time of Constantine. See, that's what made me think about why did he say that? And that's why I focus a lot on Constantine. He made me realize that's where this got solidified. So Paul is long dead when this is really happening, when he becomes the influence that we know him today as. He was not influential until Constantine. He continues, when it was found possible to clothe the whole pagan organization of life in a Christian dress. Oh my goodness. And without changing it to call it Christianity. Isn't that interesting? Leo Tolstoy, My Religion, 1884 at 219. Let's see if that page still works. Google has changed their things. Okay. You can still get the book. You can just download it in PDF and you can get it. And there it is. So My Religion by Graf Leo Tolstoy, 1885. Worth every penny, which means it's free and it's worth a million bucks if you ask me. Anything like Leo Tolstoy is worth everything. You can pay for it. Anyway, so let's keep reading, but I just want you to see he's realizing Paul has a separation between what's called he calls a doctrine of life and the explanation of life, meaning he thinks there's something about having a doctrine of life and then an explanation of your life, that Paul was the first one to separate these two things out so you can have a doctrine of life different from the explanation of life. And Paul, I think he's going to say is, he'll explain your life, but he doesn't give you a doctrine of life. So it has no depth. It's just a surface thing. It explains your life, but it doesn't give you the doctrine of life. It doesn't teach you anything, how to live. It began with the preaching of Paul, who knew not the ethical teaching set forth in the Gospel of Matthew. So you also see that he sees the Gospel of Matthew as the key gospel, which it is. I think also Luke has a similar role, but secondary because it's not apostolic. Who preached a metaphysico-Kabbalistic theory. We'll have to kind of break that apart to understand what he's talking about. But metaphysical means, not like out of another world type of thing. And Kabbalistic is sort of like kind of like almost secretive, that you're part of a cabal, that your group is has this secret message. And Paul talks a lot about having a mystery that was entirely foreign, not a little bit foreign, entirely foreign to Christ. And this separation was perfected in the time of Constantine. So long after Paul's death, this separation between the doctrine of life and explanation of life was solidified in the time of Constantine. And that's true. That's important. And that's who wrecked the Christian religion. And then watch what he says. It was found possible to clothe the whole pagan organization of life, because so now Christianity would be without Christ. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I could actually add him in here, but he doesn't ever come out directly against Paul, but he comes out against what he calls cheap grace. So in a sense, he's anti-Paul, but he never is explicit, so I can't include Bonhoeffer. But I consider him pretty much a genius too. But anyway, he's not openly anti-Paul. The others were out in the open, including Tolstoy. But the point is that he saw that Constantine was paganism, and then it was a pagan organization given a Christian dress. You just put on the robes. You give the nuns the habits on their head and the rosary beads and all these things. And God bless the nuns who took care of me when I was in grammar school, Catholic school, and the priests who were nice. But you know what? It was just dress up. And I don't mean that disrespectfully to all of them in their spiritual lives, and many of them were deep, sincere Christians. But really what they were doing is acting out a play of paganism. This is how the pagans operated. They had the Vestal Virgins. That's now the nuns. They had the priests who were, equally like the eunuchs of the Roman Empire. Those are considered high-level people because they were less risky to have around. So what we continue to have, it's a throwback to a pagan era, not to Christianity, not to Judaism, per se. I mean, they didn't have Vestal Virgins, and maybe they did have priests. That much you could say would be similar, but it was different. There was no the pagan religions had this ceremony where you would give bread and wine and all of that for a communion type meal, and I know that we do that, and it doesn't. I'm not saying it's inherently pagan or not, but when you have a priest doing it, that's when it becomes pagan. When you don't need that in Christianity, it should just be we're all brothers and sisters, right? But when you create an officiating class for something that was never intended by Christ to be that way. It was supposed to be we were all one and we can just, share a communion. It infused itself and it changed Christianity into something more pagan when Constantine became there. So in that one paragraph, in just one sentence, if you look at it, it's a sentence. It's one thought. And the genius and everything in one sentence is extraordinary. So sometimes I just go back and I read this and I go, wow. And it's proven everything he said here. I've gone and checked and double checked and triple checked. So this is where I got some inspiration. Like, why is Constantine important? People wonder why, Doug, why do you pay attention to Constantine? Because this is where it changed. This is where Constantine could censor all the history of the past, and things will he'll create an illusion, and he's going to change Christianity into paganism and then dress it up in the old Christian, garb and make us not see what's going on. It was a bunch of game of mirrors and that kind of thing. Let's continue. So now we've gone over one paragraph. I'll stop here and then I'll come right back. All right. So the next paragraph. Later, Tolstoy will explain what happened by an analogy to an original pilot who had rules replaced by a new pilot who has no rules but only dogma to accept. And this is how he puts it. Imagine and see, he's a writer, so he likes to paint pictures, and this is a really good picture. Imagine a number of men rowing a boat, a pilot steering. The men rely upon the pilot, and the pilot steers well. But after a time, the good pilot is replaced by another who does not steer at all. The boat moves along rapidly and easily. At first, the men do not notice the negligence of the new pilot. They are only pleased to find that the boat goes along so easily. Then they discover that the new pilot is utterly useless, and they mock at him and drive him from his place. So this is what he's foreseeing is going to happen with Paul or in Paulinism. People are going to realize this is useless to us. He's not getting us anywhere. And they will eventually throw Paul out. And I pray to God he's right. And he's a genius. And so I'm counting on him having had virtual inspiration from God of what's going to happen eventually. And it has to happen because he's totally obviously false. You could pull the con of Paul for a period of time, and you're going to say, well, this is too long a period of time. 2,000 years is a flash in a pan. I have a feeling we don't realize how much more time there is. There's going to be a lot of bad things happening. But we might have another 2,000 years, and he's going to eventually be driven out of Christianity because he is so obviously false. And there's going to be more challenges, and there'll be other challenges, okay? But he will eventually be tossed. I'm confident of that because it's just the evidence is overwhelming, and it's now rising and percolating. I hope there's more discoveries from ancient manuscripts that will help, though. Anyway, let's keep reading. Tolstoy perceives the church led by the new pilot. So this story continues. Paul is now recognized as useless to give meaning to life. Remember what I was telling you? He was saying life has now been divided up, that there's a doctrine of life and there's the explanation of life, and Paul began this separation. Regardless, men who do know about Jesus and even hate his name are still drawn to Jesus' principles that they have unconsciously absorbed. In this time when people might be prepared to call back the first pilot, meaning Jesus, the church is afraid to call upon him to return to restore the right principles of living. And see, this is true, particularly with Paulinism, is people get so used to Paul, they're almost hesitant to ask for help from Jesus. Like, can we get some lessons from Jesus? We've been relying on Paul for so long, but we're not going anywhere. Can we bring back our old pilot? We've had this useless pilot, but we need somebody who can really guide us. Can we go there? And they're afraid because they've been gotten so used to Paul. Anyway, instead, the majority of society, let's go back here. The majority of society and the church as a whole are clinging onto the belief that the only rules of life come from government. So we forget that one of Paul's key principles is that you must treat the rulers above you as oracles of God. He basically says that they act as actual oracles of God. Their words, their actions are from God, and you must obey them from conscience sake, for the sake of angels, the way he puts it. So there is no freedom to disobey the government in all times, and that's one of the major failings of Paul. He's obviously there's something wrong when you can't see that the government can be wrong, particularly when you're regulated by the government. And the true apostles had the right view, which is when they were commanded not to preach the gospel, they said, we have to obey God, not men. But if Paul was ever ordered to not preach the gospel, I wonder how he would have done it. People say, well, he obviously got killed for disobeying the government. No, no, we never see him preaching where he's been prohibited from preaching, even in the book of Acts. He preaches, and then there's people get outraged and they get angry, but we don't see him being told you can't preach, and then he preaches anyway. But I digress. But anyway, the point really is this: is that in Tolstoy's picture, he's trying to say that we have this useless rudder, and we want to go back to Jesus, but we've adopted this idea from Paul that we need to follow whatever the government tells us to do. So we start to put ourselves on an autopilot. In the modern world, most think it is not important to return to Jesus and his principles. Okay, so we have now the government to give us our ethics and morals. That's what he's saying. Instead, most believe the state must be obeyed as ministers of God, as Paul taught in Romans 13, verse 1. As a result, life has now become devoid of meaning to the great masses. Okay. And this is pure genius. And listen to this. The distinctive trait of civilized man is to obey what the majority of men regard as iniquitous, contrary to conscience. I seek in vain in civilized society as it exists today for any clearly formulated moral basis of life. There are none. Do you see what he's saying is you look out the world and you look at our United States of America. Now, of course, it's been getting worse and worse and worse. But there is no clear moral values except, you can't use someone's pronouns incorrectly. I mean, we've come down to the level that we're worried about a person's pronouns. What about the life of a homeless person in the street? We're tolerant. We've become insensitive to people who are poor and needy. Just to give you an example, and what will Christ have said? Go help them, right? Not that we do that. There's no, I live far away from downtown Los Angeles, but I can see it on the television. How do we help these people? So, but anyway, we live in a society where we no longer have any clearly formulated moral basis of life. It's been taken over, particularly when you have the state involved. There are none. No perception of their necessity exists. On the contrary, we find the extraordinary conviction that they are superfluous, that religion is nothing more than a few words about God and a future life, and a few ceremonies very useful for the salvation of the soul, according to some, and good for nothing, according to others, but that life happens of itself and has no need of any fundamental rule, and that we have only to do what we are told to do. So yes, we live in this kind of society where we're waiting to be told what to do, and we have no moral center as a culture, as people. And when that happens, you're in dissolution, in essence. So he's spotting the problem is we had a useless rudder. We were no longer following Christ. We've had become pagans since the Constantinian era. We use the outward dress of religion, but we don't have anything on the inside of us. We've become progressively deader and deader and deader. Tolstoy says the solution is now to go back to the original pilot, Jesus. We need to restore the church to the Jesus words only, I'm using my phrase, principles, and to leave the old dogma-laden church to its dissolution. So basically saying, well, you can't even reform it. It's just so lost, the current church system. And you'll see why. I mean, okay, let's see what he says. I can always interrupt him, and I need you to listen to him, not me. The truth of the doctrine of Jesus, once unconsciously absorbed by humanity through the organism of the church, must now be consciously recognized. In other words, we've got to grasp it consciously. We've got to make an effort to bring back Jesus, bring back his words. Go read the Sermon on the Mount, memorize it, bring it into fixture into society. For in the truth of this doctrine, humanity has always obtained its vital force. Men must lift up the torch of truth. Men and women must lift up the torch of truth, which has so long remained concealed, and carry it before them, guiding their actions by its light. The doctrine of Jesus as a religion that governs the actions of men and explains to them the meaning of life. See, what he's saying is we got away from the meaning of life. We don't, when you let go of Jesus, you've lost track of what are we all doing here, is now before the world just as it was 1800 years ago. So he's living in 1800s. Formerly, the world had the explanation of the church, which in concealing the doctrine seemed in itself to offer a satisfactory interpretation of life. But now the time has come when the church has lost its usefulness, and the world, having no other means for sustaining its true existence, can only feel its helplessness and go for aid directly to the doctrine of Jesus. So I think that's what people are waiting for. They're waiting for an opening, and it's going to happen when the Paulinism stranglehold on Christianity is strangled and dies, which it will, because it can't hold on much longer. It's a lie of since the time of Constantine. That's when, again, the point he's bringing up. This only happened in Constantine's years. Paul was relatively unknown and ineffective between the time he died and around 64 until about the 325 era, when Constantine wanted someone who could abolish Sabbath for him, and Paul was the made-to-order apostle for himself. So he was Constantine's best apostle, the only apostle he cared about, because he could get rid of Sabbath, which he wanted everybody to worship on the day of the sun. Constantine, thought he was the god of the sun. Got to remember that. He made a statue of himself in Constantinople, put his face in the statue of Apollo, the god of the sun, the Greek name of the god of the sun. And he was in Rome. It would be in the statue, the same statue. It was over the arch, Constantine's arch, and it was his face again on the Sol Invictus person who was riding a chariot on top of the Constantine arch, and that's in a museum also in Rome. Anyway, let's keep going. Tolstoy concludes with an exaltation of Jesus' doctrine as shining forth still boldly if anyone would but read it. So let's just take a break, and then we're going to read. All right, so he continues. Tolstoy writes, "The doctrine of Jesus is the light. The light shines forth, and the darkness cannot conceal it. Men cannot deny it. Men cannot refuse to accept its guidance. They must depend on the doctrine of Jesus, which penetrates among all the errors with which the life of men is surrounded." I'm going to pause right there. Sometimes we do not understand as Christians the impact of Christ's words. When you say those words, God, I don't want to say it's magical, but it's almost like it's magic. It resonates with people. The words that God created are conceptually transferable from one language to another, and when people hear it in Spanish or Italian or Russian, obviously, it all resonates the same way, and it's truth in such a way that it profoundly impacts the human psyche. And I believe that's because Jesus is speaking the words of God, and God knows our own minds. He designed our minds so he could put principles out there that we would be attracted to, and yet they're not easy. They call for cost and sacrifice and love and honor and all these other principles to come into play, but they're unique and you won't find them anywhere else, and we don't realize the treasure they represent. And so teaching them and preaching them and sharing them is the best thing you can ever do for yourself and for others, because they are very unique. They're very unique words. So it goes on. Like the insensible ether, filling universal space, enveloping all created things, so the doctrine of Jesus is inevitable for every man in whatever situation he may be found. Men cannot refuse to recognize the doctrine of Jesus. They may deny the metaphysical explanation of life, which it gives. We may deny everything. But the doctrine of Jesus alone offers rules for the conduct of life without which humanity has never lived. In other words, these are eternal principles from the beginning of humanity. When you hear them, you see, you recognize it. So there's nothing in Paul that has the same resonance at all. I mean, nothing. It's at that depth of level. He has a lot of well-sounding statements, and things that are easier to memorize because they've been repeated over and over again. But you cannot even compare the light you see when you listen to Jesus compared to Paul. And if you really read Paul and you understand him, the darker and darker you realize he gets. The more egotistical you see he is, the more vain, the more wackadoodle doctrines about women being saved through childbirth. Women can't talk in church. I mean, when you really start boiling him down and start really studying him, the less you want to even deal with him as a human being. And if you could only have somebody else teaching you, you go, is there somebody else? Yes, there is. But you're told as a Paulinist, you're not allowed to go to Jesus. Jesus didn't know as much as Paul, didn't understand the law was being done away with. So the Paulinist is always being led away from the one thing that he really knows he needs or she needs, but they're told not to go there. Jesus is never given as an option because he was not as wise as Paul was. That was Luther's view, by the way, and that's saturated into Protestantism. And even though we don't any longer recognize what Luther was doing and said to us, and we don't really follow it, we think Jesus is probably as smart as Paul, but we don't realize he's superior to Paul in a huge way. I continue now. But the doctrine of Jesus alone offers rules for the conduct of life without which humanity has never lived and never will be able to live, without which no human being has lived or can live, if he would live as man should live, a reasonable life. The power of the doctrine of Jesus is not in its explanation of the meaning of life, but in the rules that it gives for the conduct of life. Do you see that? The power of the doctrine of Jesus is not in the explanation of the meaning of life. People can tell you, here's what life means. But he's saying that's not where it comes from. That's not its power. Its power is the doctrine of the rules but in the rules that it gives for the conduct of life. That's the true meaning of life. Once you know the conduct of life, now you know the meaning of life. In other words, people who die, let's just say if you go to war and you're suffering battle or you are killed, you are closer to understanding the meaning of life because you are sacrificing something for something greater than yourself. Well, Christ is the one who teaches these principles to us in the first place. And he puts a lot of things on value of your parents, value of your Christ himself, God. You will sacrifice, be loyal to principles, truth, and you have a leader who is completely dedicated himself to having sacrificed everything and suffered everything possible for the sake of truth. And so you have somebody to follow in their footsteps and emulate to the greatest sacrifice possible. So this is why Christianity will always have this superiority to other teachers, because there's been no teacher who was willing to sacrifice everything to stand for the truth and preserve the truth truly. Anyway, I digress. Let's keep going. Tolstoy concludes the chapter with this simple principle: the faith that triumphs over the doctrines of the world is faith in the doctrine of Jesus. Now let's listen to this again. The faith that triumphs over the doctrines of the world, all the worldly doctrines, is the faith in the doctrine of Jesus. So he puts faith or trust in the doctrines of Jesus, which means he's going to obey the doctrines of Jesus. Now, this is exactly what Jesus teaches. So what we point out is in John 20, I think it's 25 times, Jesus uses the phrase pisteuo in Greek, Pisteuo, and then the preposition eis, eis. And that means it's translated typically as believe in, and that is totally wrong. Eis is unto, and pisteuo can mean obey, comply, or it can mean sometimes believe if the object are facts. So did you bestow, in the hour you were supposed to leave? Yes, I believed I was supposed to leave at 3 o'clock. Yeah, I could say I bestow N-E-N, that time period is when I had to leave. But that is not the way it's used in the Gospels. It's pisto eis Jesus, or pisto eis the Son, or pisto eis God. Those mean, when used in conjunction with a person, a being, is you are obeying unto that person. And that's actually now been in an theological dictionary since the 1990s. But the NIV itself doesn't obey and follow its own theological dictionary because it's too controversial to put the truth in there. Do you realize that? And we have that in our we have numerous videos. Look it up, Pistow, NIV Theological Dictionary, and you'll see I bought the dictionary so I could open it up to everybody. I put a PDF up online that at least has that one page available with the face pages. You could share it with other people. You can keep it just for your own treasure. So anytime you have doubt, you just pull it back up and you go, there it is. It says right there, Pistow, when directed at a person, means obey. And I actually, on a video I show you, I go through all the steps that show in the play of Sophocles. I think it's Tyrannus Rex. It talks about pisto eis onto somebody, and it's translated by neutral parties as obey or comply unto that figure in that particular play. So that's how it's translated. That's how it should be translated. That's what it means. And so Tolstoy is saying is that faith that triumphs over the doctrines of the world is the faith in the doctrine of Jesus, which really means in the trust to obey the doctrines of Jesus. Now, let's do a step-by-step reading. We have a little bit more homework with Tolstoy. Let's go back now and see Tolstoy's reasoning in the greater context. So I skipped over his reasoning. So he gives some explanation. So I now want to show you what he was talking about. Leading into the first quote, the big quote, which was the one I read here first. The separation between the doctrine of life and the preaching of Paul is basically Paul was teaching something completely foreign from Jesus. Okay, so here is some of his reasoning. I became convinced that the doctrine of the church, although bearing the name of Christian, is one with the darkness against which Jesus struggled and against which he commanded his disciples to strive. So what he's saying is now we are following Paul, a Pharisee, and Jesus was struggling and resisting them. Now, what was the Pharisees known for according to Jesus? Paul claims they were rigidly very legalistic. They were enforcing the law. And so Paul is trying to tell Christians, you need to get away from the law. So Paul seems to be teaching us that Jesus' enemies were the Pharisees because they were pro-law. Well, but Jesus actually teaches the opposite. In Matthew 23:23, he says, you Pharisees, you're very good about tithing, but you neglect to teach the greater principles of the law, the principle of mercy, the principle of the judgments of the law, and the principle of pistis. And I'm going to go through those three real quickly. Mercy, as in Exodus 20, verse 6, and it says there, God, between the first and the second of the 10 commandments, he says, I extend mercy, has said, to those who love me and obey my commandments. So what is the basis of mercy or forgiveness or grace? It is, God says, repent, come back, love me again, and obey my commandments again, and I will have mercy on you. That's how it works. There's grace. What were the Pharisees not teaching? They were not teaching God's doctrine of grace. Does Paul teach the gospel of grace that Jesus was talking about, the mercy principle in the 10 commandments? No. Paul was teaching the opposite of that. He was teaching the gospel of the Pharisees, which was cheap grace. How do I know that? Because we know independently from Josephus that the Pharisees taught the Jewish people they didn't have to do any obedience at all. They were all predestined to be saved. All Israel will be saved. Paul actually says in, I think it's Romans 10 or 12, can't remember at the moment, or yeah, I think it's 10 or 12. And he's just repeating exactly a Pharisee doctrine. And the Pharisees were known as strict, unconditional election advocates, meaning all Abrahamic heirs were guaranteed to go to heaven because they believed in eternal life. And nothing they could do could lose their salvation. So Paul was completely of that mind. The only thing he said for a Gentile that you could do to share in that same unconditional election is just have faith that Jesus had died, was buried, and was resurrected. That's 1 Corinthians, I got to remember, 14 verses 1 to 4. I think that's it. So he made up a simple formula that was almost as simple and a little effort as possible, that would be almost as close as possible to the doctrine of the Pharisees. And then he built in a doctrine of unconditional election also for the Gentile too, which was once you believed, you were unconditionally elected to be saved, something like that. So Paul very much taught the doctrines of the Pharisees, even as a Christian, but he was making you think the Pharisees were strictly following the law and were legalistic when they were anti-legalistic. They did not follow the law, and Jesus said they would teach commandments of men in derogation of the law, right? He said, hey, you teach people they can pay a korban payment to the temple, and then they're relieved of their obligation to take care of mom and dad when mom and dad fall into poverty. You with your commandments of men have made of none effect the law of God. That's what the honor your mother and father meant, is that you cannot let them fall into poverty. And the Pharisee doctrine was you could, as long as you had paid a big sizable sum to the temple many years earlier, and you got assurance that your mom and dad would be taken care of by the temple. And Jesus saying, no, 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 no. You can't pawn off your obligation to the temple. And those people in the temple would always say, well, we don't remember having that promise, or we don't think we have to pay that much to your mom and dad, just enough for they will give them enough money that they barely survive. Okay. So that's all. That Jesus was dealing with a group of people who were denigrators of the law, the Pharisees. And also, you need to know the Pharisees taught that the Gentiles should not even read the law, and if they did, they should be subject to a death penalty for reading the law. I have a whole article on that. So they had a very strict rule that if you read the law, it will kill you. Read Galatians 3 and 4, and you'll see Paul's doctrine exactly matched the Pharisees. He said, oh my gosh, I'm worried about you. You want to read the law. It's going to kill you. You will be severed from Christ if you get circumcised. You will be in bondage again if you want to observe days and seasons and Sabbaths. So this is Galatians 3 and 4, very much Pharisaical doctrine. But I digress. So now we continue. But with regard to the doctrine of Jesus, as with regard to all the other doctrines, men wander from its precepts, and they always find someone to justify their deviations. So you want to get away from Jesus, you'll find Paul. He's always going to provide you a way to avoid Jesus. Those who, as Jesus said, sit in Moses' seat, explain the metaphysical theory in such a way that the ethical prescriptions of the doctrine cease to be regarded as obligatory. So see, he understood the Pharisees were actually looseners of the law. Do you see this? Tolstoy had read enough, and by the way, this is scholarship at the time of 1880s had risen, so that Tolstoy, if he could read French, if he could read any of the books from Europe, he was learning. Josephus was at that time the only source that you could figure this out, that the Pharisees were looseners of the law. And so he now knows that, and he's now realizing, aha, Paul was saying they were strict. Jesus says they're loose. Josephus says they're loose. And by the way, now we know the Dead Sea Scrolls say they were also loose about the law. So it's completely, Paul gives us a false impression of who the Pharisees are. And now Tolstoy, being aware, as he's obviously reading the European literature, he's learning the Pharisees were looseners of the law, and their principles of election were making the law easy to comply with, making it that you don't really have to do many ethical rules at all in order to be saved. And they're replaced by external forms of worship by ceremonial. So yes, I mean, the Pharisees would do ceremonial things because those are easy. You just go through the motions. You don't have to do anything but just go through the motions. Wear your little garb, go to the synagogue, do the prayers and then leave. Ceremonies, that's Catholicism. So Catholicism had the spirit of Pharisaism built into it, and that ultimately gets us all the way in a circle back to Paul. This is a condition common to all religions, but to me, it seems that it never has been manifested with so much pomp as in connection with Christianity, and for two reasons. First, because the doctrine of Jesus is the most elevated of all doctrines, the most elevated because the metaphysical and ethical portions are so closely united that one cannot be separated from the other without destroying the vitality of the whole. Second, because the doctrine of Jesus is also a protest against all forms, a negation not only of Jewish ceremonial, but of all exterior rites of worship. That's kind of true. Jesus did not put any emphasis on exterior types of worship. He seemed to like walking around as a teacher and didn't go big into, um, what we would call ceremonial Judaism. He was much more into the vigorous activity of walking out and talking and being with people and sharing in their sufferings and healing and ministry to people, poor and hungry and all that. He was showing that religion isn't inside of a church building. Religion isn't doing all the activities that you might do ceremonially wise. It's not that he said not to do it. He just was emphasizing an active spiritual life with others. Anyway, let me continue. This is a condition common to all religions, but to me, it seems that it never has been manifested with so much pomp as in connection with Christianity, and for two reasons. First, because the doctrine of Jesus is the most elevated of all doctrines, the most elevated because the metaphysical and ethical portions are so closely united that one cannot be separated from the other without destroying the vitality of the whole. Second, because the doctrine of Jesus is in itself a protest against all forms, a negation not only of the Jewish ceremonial, but of all exterior rites of worship. Therefore, the arbitrary separation of the metaphysical and the ethical aspects of Christianity entirely disfigures the doctrine. So when you get rid of ethical and you just have metaphysical, is there three gods or two gods, one God? That's all metaphysical stuff. But you don't have any ethics, then it's nothing. It disfigures the doctrine of Christ. And it deprives it of every sort of meaning, which is where we are currently. Then appears the quote on Paul above, where the Pauline doctrine creates this separation, which deprives Jesus' message of every sort of meaning. Then the text continues on page 219. After Constantine, that arch-pagan, so true, whom the church, in spite of all his crimes and vices, admits to the category of the saints. Oh, he's right on. I mean, this guy was a murderer. He was, a pagan through and through, and we called him a saint. What would these people thought were conning us? These people who were in leadership of the church, I cannot believe they were Christians anymore. I've come to the conclusion they were paid lackeys. And I even have come to the position where I think Eusebius, no matter what he claims, something's wrong there in Denmark. And the only thing that could ever redeem is if he was play acting a second role of being the only way to preserve Christian history was to pretend to go along with Constantine and be a complete sycophant, which is what he was, complete sycophant, and worshiping. Made it sound like he was worshiping Constantine, which an egomaniac might be impressed by. And that's the only way Eusebius will ever come out of that picture looking good. But otherwise, he looks like a complete sycophant. So I pray to God he thought his mission was to save the memory of the church, and that's why he was behaving the way he was. But just the gall of it all. And anyway, all right. So Constantine, that arch-pagan, whom the church, in spite of all his crimes and vices, admits to the category of the saints after Constantine, became the domination of the councils, and the center of gravity of Christianity was permanently displaced till only the metaphysical portion was left in view. The metaphysical meaning the Trinity. Okay, I mean, he's not going there. He's not going to mention that, but that's the point. Isn't Christianity, when you read all those books now from the 325 to 381 period, when the Trinity's first coming up, they're all absorbed in metaphysical questions. Is there three gods or one God, two gods? how many angels stand on the head of pins. I mean, they became so abstract that no longer did we have any doctrine about how to live. And this metaphysical theory, with its accompanying ceremonial, deviated more and more from its true and primitive meaning until it has reached its present stage of development as a doctrine which explains the mysteries of a celestial life beyond the comprehension of human reason. Yeah. So that's another thing. I mean, so now you're supposed to believe in a trinity of three beings and one godhood that who can even comprehend what that means? Does it mean anything? If the human mind cannot comprehend what you're saying, why are you demanding I believe it? Because I can't understand it? Is that its only virtue? Then why would God make me want to believe something that doesn't make any sense and appears contradictory to everything that Jesus says? So, but it's completely metaphysical and it's completely divorced from the messages of Jesus' doctrines about how to live life. That's what he's saying. It continues, and okay, so it has reached its present stage of development as a doctrine which explains the mysteries of a celestial life beyond the comprehension of human reason, and with all its complicated formulas, gives no religious guidance whatever with regard to the regulation of this earthly life. Trinitarianism gives absolutely no guidance to how to live your life. None. Zero. It doesn't make you a better person, doesn't make you less of a person, except I would say this, if it's wrong, if it's idolatry, it makes you a sinner going to hell. So that to me is why I don't understand why people insist on believing in it, because if you don't believe in it, you're not going to hell for not believing in it. Can we get that? Can we get an amen to that? There's no command saying if you don't believe in it somewhere, show me if you can find it. You're going to hell if you don't believe in the Trinity. No, it doesn't say that anywhere. No. But what about if I have another God in place of the Father when Jesus says he's the only true God? Yeah, that to send you to hell because that's a violation of the very first commandment. And you have to love God with your whole heart, mind, and soul. So if you're going to make Jesus the Son of equal importance or maybe greater than the Father, you are subtracting from the nature of God someone else is sharing the glory of being God, the creator God, the Father, with somebody else. And in fact, when you add Paul into the mix, where Paul says Jesus was, after God created Jesus, this is Colossians 1, 15, 16, and 17. After God created Jesus, then Jesus next, the first begotten, then created everything else from that point on, and or it's sometimes translated, and then through Christ, all things were begotten. So now Jesus becomes a co-creator with God. We have now taken what was formerly a unique aspect of God and taken it away. Now, these are all metaphysical questions, but the consequence of that is actually not metaphysical. It is you're taking away the love and honor that God should get as your Father, your Creator, and now you have this concept that Jesus, in some respect, is your Creator as well, because it really reads that way. First, God creates Jesus, then Jesus creates the rest of creation, maybe with God's assistance, not clear. It's vague. God is now a vague father. Jesus is more obviously the direct progenitor of you and me, if you believe in Colossians 1, 15, 16, and 17. Let's continue, and we're almost done here. I mean, there's more, but I wanted to go over this so that you could get the depth of which he's thinking. And I'm gonna stop this right now. Okay, and so next we're going to get to, it seems we're going to get to the issue of the Council of Nicaea. Let's see. I have not read this in years. I wrote this probably 9 years ago, but it's timeless. Tolstoy is a timeless character. One senses here that Tolstoy balks at the Council of Nicaea. That's the 325 conference that made Jesus God the Son. And then there was God the Father, but there was no God the Holy Spirit yet. So they hadn't done that. That will take till 381 to make that decision. And the emphasis about the correct formula to depict Christ, taking the emphasis away from the ethical teachings of Jesus. Tolstoy next makes the point that a religion where belief is all that matters becomes a peculiar one where behavior no longer holds central importance. Tolstoy calls this pseudo-Christianity. Did you ever think about that? And I know if you talk to a Pauline Christian, they'll say, "Oh, well, a Christianity, which is just about, behavior and all that kind of stuff, that's kinda like a waste of time. You gotta spend time on dealing with, who is Jesus. You gotta understand who he is. If you don't understand who he is, then you really don't have Christianity." They do all these excuses so they don't have to actually teach and listen and notice that the Gospels, all four Gospels, well, okay, let's take Matthew, Luke, and John first. Matthew, Luke, and Mark. Those Gospels spend like almost zero time on the uh, well, the most important command they'll say is to love God with your whole heart, mind, soul, and in John's gospel, we'll talk about Jesus being, assuming that the Father is the only true God, John 17:3. But really and truly, all the gospels, actually, all of them are mostly focused on the ethical teachings of Jesus and the importance of obeying Jesus. That's pretty much it. But these people think, well, really, it should spend a lot more attention into the prologue of John, which is the only point in any of the four gospels where you can say there's some real attention being paid to the nature of Jesus. Is he in his essence the Word, or is he just called the Word? And that's a key argument, key issues for some people. But he, anyway, so that's what ended up happening. We have but Tolstoy says that leads to a pseudo Christianity where you no longer focused on what really matters, what the Gospels were mostly all about, the ethical teachings of Jesus. And that's also the prophecy of the prophet, Deuteronomy 18, verses 16 to 19. We're all about God's going to send a special prophet who will give these teachings that God wants and will hold all men accountable to believe in. And they weren't going to be about, obviously, how many angels are on a pin, how many gods can you fit into one Godhead. I mean, it's just not going to be anything like that, obviously, I think. So here's what he says. All religions, with the exception of the religion of the Christian church, demand from their adherents, aside from forms and ceremonies, the practice of certain actions called good and abstinence from certain actions that are called bad. Okay? The Jewish religion prescribes circumcision, the observance of the Sabbath, the giving of alms, the feast of the Passover. Mohammedanism, I don't know how to say this word. I'm sorry. No disrespect. Mohammedanism prescribes circumcision. Oh, I didn't know that. Prayer 5 times a day, the giving of tithes to the poor. That's very good, by the way. Pilgrimage to the tomb of the prophet, and many other things. It is the same with all other religions. Whether these prescriptions are good or bad, they are prescriptions which exact the performance of certain actions. Pseudo-Christianity alone prescribes nothing. So that's where we've ended up. We have because we've followed Paul. We have no requirements at all for anything. There is nothing that a Christian is obliged to observe except fasts and prayers, which the church itself does not recognize as obligatory. So really nothing's obligatory for us to do. We just can live our life any way we want. All that is necessary to the pseudo-Christian is the sacrament, meaning you periodically take communion. But the sacrament is not fulfilled by the believer, it is administered to him by others. The pseudo-Christian is obliged to do nothing or to abstain from nothing for his own salvation. You're obliged to do nothing for your salvation, and you're obliged to abstain from nothing for your own salvation. So that's what you learn from Paulinism. You must not even try to do anything to get saved, because if you do that, you're working for your salvation and you're lost. The very thought that you need to do anything leads to damnation. That's what you're taught from Paul, right? So don't ever have that in your mind. Free yourself from those chains, Paul would say, your bondage to that. Okay. The pseudo-Christian is obliged to do nothing or to abstain from nothing for his own salvation, since the church administers to him everything which he has need. So again, the only thing you need to do is take communion, and the church will hand the lap. The church baptizes him, anoints him, gives him the Eucharist, confesses him even after he has lost consciousness, administers extreme unction to him, and prays for him, and he is saved. From the time of Constantine, the Christian church has prescribed no religious duties to its adherents. It has never required that they should abstain from anything. The Christian church has recognized and sanctioned divorce, slavery, right? Went through centuries of slavery with no prohibition. Even though, by the way, did you know the Mosaic law prohibited expressly kidnapping people for purposes of enslaving them. And so there was one type of slave that had to be freed, and that was that one. And the entire United States and all the European colonies were created using slaves that had been kidnapped from Africa, primarily, in violation of the Bible, violation of the law. Tribunals, all earthly powers, the death penalty, and war. So they sanctioned the death penalty and war. He doesn't like the death penalty. I don't have a problem with the death penalty if it's involved in crimes that are prohibited in the Bible, and you use the rule of direct evidence where you can't use circumstantial evidence to put someone to death for murder. That means somebody has to see that person kill somebody. So before the law takes the extreme unction of killing someone, you have to know you are executing the person who did the crime. Otherwise, gotta pay. We just gotta pay to put them in a prison cell and wait for their natural death. That's my view, because that's a biblical view. The Bible didn't put people away on circumstantial evidence, and lots of times that's wrong. There's mistakes. Circumstantial evidence is inherently subject to making mistakes. From the time of Constantine, the Christian church has prescribed no religious duties to its adherents. It is never required that they should abstain from anything. Okay, I think I went through that. It has exacted nothing except a renunciation of the purpose to do evil on the occasion of baptism, and this only in its early days. And later on, with infant baptism was introduced, even this requirement was no longer observed. Okay, so he basically shows that Christianity has become a Christianity without Christ, a valueless, meaningless, non-efficacious faith, because we have diluted it of all substance except this metaphysical attention to the Trinity. And if you don't believe in it, you're damned. If you do, you're saved somehow, and all kinds of things that are completely traditions of human beings that never existed at the time of Christ, and he never preached on. Okay, now let's go to next paragraph. Tolstoy next comments that this has led to a Christianity without Christ. The church confesses the doctrine of Jesus in theory, but denies it in practice. Instead of guiding the life of the world, the church, through affection for the world, expounds the metaphysical doctrine of Jesus in such a way as not to derive from it any obligation as to the conduct of life, any necessity for men to live differently from the way in which they have been living. The church is surrendered to the world and simply follows the main train of its victor. The world does as it pleases and leaves to the church the tasks of justifying its actions with the explanations as to the meaning of life. The world organizes an existence of absolute opposition to the doctrine of Jesus, and the church endeavors to demonstrate the men who live contrary to the doctrine of Jesus really live in accordance with that doctrine. So in other words, we've stripped away the doctrines of Jesus, and then when anyone asks, we try to convince everybody and say, "Oh no, everyone in our church is following the doctrines of Jesus," when they're not. They're not even being taught the doctrines of Jesus. They incessantly hear at church every week the doctrines of Paul, not the doctrines of Jesus. The final result is that the world lives a worse than pagan existence. Worse than pagan existence. Yeah, I want to talk about that in a second. And the church not only approves them, but maintains that this existence is in exact conformity with the doctrine of Jesus. So we are worse than pagans. Pagans actually had religious zeal for their gods, even though they were misguided, right? We don't even have that anymore. Our gods are actors and actresses and baseball stars and hockey players, and some of that. I mean, it's just, we don't realize how we have made it gods of other things than but they're not. But unlike the pagans gods had sometimes values or attributes that then the people would try to replicate. But we don't even have that. We just have actors and actresses and baseball stars and things like that. Tolstoy then says the light from Jesus' words are still powerful and sometimes break through the cloud used to keep us from them. But a time comes when the light of the true doctrine of Jesus shines forth from the Gospels, notwithstanding the guilty efforts of the church to conceal it from men's eyes, as for instance in prohibiting the translation of the Bible. There comes a time when the light reaches the people, even though the medium of sectarians and freethinkers and the falsity of the doctrine of the church is shown so clearly that men begin to transform the method of living that the church has justified. Tolstoy sees steps that have been taken despite the church that approximate better Jesus' teachings. That is, the end of popery, the papacy basically, and divine rights of kings. We've gotten right into that. Charity of property. But this movement of civil rights breaks down the authority of the church, transferring power to secular authorities. The church, which abandoned Christ long ago, is left with empty dogmas and buildings. So basically, he's saying, you, Christianity, you should have been doing these things. And now, by your not having done it, the government has stepped in, is now doing what you should have been doing in terms of charity and so on. And in this way, the conduct of human life is freed from the control of the church and subjected to an entirely different authority. The church retains its dogmas, but what are the dogmas? Are its dogmas worth? A metaphysical explanation can be of use only when there is a doctrine of life which it serves to make manifest. So it's talking about the idea of, God being three in one, or just even God at all. It's a metaphysical concept, but if you don't teach anybody how to live, it's just words on a page. It doesn't have any concrete activity on a day-to-day basis. But the church possesses only the explanation of an organization which it once sanctioned and which no longer exists. The church has nothing left but temples and shrines and canonicals and vestments and words. It's just buildings. That's all it all really has become. The church which sanctioned Christ's teachings for dogma alone finds itself abandoned and powerless in the world. What the church professed that came from Christ, but which the church abandoned, lives on in modern movements for progress. So what he's trying to say is, when you see these movements that try to help the poor, help the working class, and all this kind of stuff, even though it's political, they're still trying to do something along the lines of having values for life that reflect Christ's values for life, but they want to use politics for it. But he sees in these movements, these progressive movements, the same impetus behind what Jesus was trying to do, but this time using progressive political movements. However, the church has no influence over them because the church abandoned these equality-promoting messages long ago. And this is what he says. All these churches, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, are like so many sentinels, still keeping careful watch before the prison doors, although the prisoners have long been at liberty before their eyes and even threaten their existence. All that actually constitutes life, that is, the activity of humanity towards progress and its own welfare, socialism, communism, the new politico-economic theories, utilitarianism, the liberty and equality of all social classes and of men and women, all the moral principles of humanity, the sanctity of work, reason, science, art, all these that lend an impulse to the world's progress and hostility to the church are only fragments of the doctrine which the church has professed and so carefully endeavored to conceal. In these times, the life of the world is entirely independent of the doctrine of the church. The church is left so far behind that men no longer hear the voices of those who preach its doctrines. This is easily to be understood because the church still clings to an organization of the world's life which has been forsaken and is rapidly falling to destruction. Boy, that's quite an indictment, isn't it? So we've been left behind in all these progressive movements. They took over what we should have been teaching and preaching, basically, not for purposes of political rationales, but for purposes of just human love and caring and equity. But we handed it over to the socialists, the communists, the utilitarians, and all the other groups, and we didn't do what we were supposed to do, and we had a shell of a church left over. That's what you end up getting when you have Paulinism, is what he's saying, if you follow the whole from the top to the bottom here. Tolstoy then explains how the church became a shell following Paul's dictum to obey the government in all things, Paul's epistle to the Romans chapter 13. Tolstoy laments our faith is not entwined with ethics, but is instead all about dogmas and beliefs. Thus, rather than transforming the world with higher ethical principles to stop evil, the church now defends all things which promotes the ruler's interest. Quote, a century ago, and among the ignorant now, the nominal Christian makes this reply. Compulsory military service, wars, tribunals, and the death penalty all exist in obedience to the law of God transmitted to us by the church. That's Paul, by the way. Yeah. Because now whatever's the whatever the law is now the law of God. It's the same. If you read Romans 13, basically whatever the state enacts as law is now the law of God. This is a fallen world. All the evil that exists by God's will as a punishment for the sins of men. For this reason, we can do nothing to palliate evil. We can only save our own souls by faith, by the sacraments, by prayers, and by submission to the will of God as transmitted by the church. The church teaches us that all Christians should unhesitatingly obey their rulers, who are the Lord's anointed, and obey also persons placed in authority by rulers. That's virtually a quote of Romans 13. That they ought to defend their property, and that of others by force, wage war, inflict the death penalty, and all things submit to the authorities who command by the will of God. And do you notice what he's also pointing out is that we're also sent into wars on an unhesitating basis to basically accomplish these things. This leads into my favorite passage. Tolstoy says that when he asks Christians why they live at odds with what Jesus teaches, the Christian responds by despairing of the skepticism of the age, as if anyone who wanted to restore Jesus' words to a priority were a traitor of Christianity. And this is what he says. When we ask a Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox believer why he leads an existence contrary to the doctrines of Jesus, instead of making a correct response, he begins to speak of the melancholy state of skepticism characteristic of this generation, of evil-minded persons who spread doubt, broadcast among the masses, of the importance of the future of existing church. But he will not tell you why he does not act in conformity to the commands of the religion that he professes. Instead of speaking of his own condition, he will talk to you about the condition of humanity in general and of that of the church as if his own life were not of the slightest significance, and his sole preoccupation were the salvation of humanity and of what he calls the church. So what he's saying is, yeah, I mean, we're so preoccupied with just, where humanity, and, we need to save humanity. We don't look at our own life, that we need to be saved, truly saved by activity, by work, by obedience to God. But of course, if you're a Paulinist, that's all irrelevant. So you can just sit around and just bemoan the skepticism of the world. You have nothing to do. You've eviscerated your own requirement to do anything for Christ, and the only thing you want to do is spread this gospel of do nothing Christianity, is what he's really saying. And it's just, it's polluted and destroyed Christianity. This whole Paulinism, it's just caused a rot at the center of Christianity and destroyed the effectiveness of the Christian faith, because it's basically not Christ at all. It's a Christianity without Christ, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer called it in his book, Cost of Discipleship. We're nearing the end. When dogma and opinion about Christ is all that is left to Christianity and Jesus' ethical messages are ignored, which gives us life, there is no answer one can give the meaning of life that suffices. His next quote is as follows. This subterfuge is employed simply because the believer and the philosopher and the average man have no positive doctrine concerning existence and cannot therefore reply to the personal question, what of your own life? That's a question that Paulinists can't answer. Well, me, my life, what does my life matter? I don't have to tell you about my life, what I do. I have nothing to do. Don't make me do work. I'm not doing works. You're just and they get defensive and they don't want to talk about, having to do anything because they're emphatic. You're a sinner. To tell them that life requires, like the sheep and the goats, take care of your brother. If they didn't get dressed, water, clothing, all that, that was your obligation. You didn't do any of that. Well, that's works. That Jesus was talking to do a different dispensation. I don't have to do any of that. That's what you'll get. They're disgusted and humiliated at not possessing the slightest trace of doctrine with regard to life. That's ultimately what happens with Paulinists. They get disgusted at you that you even bring it up, that they have nothing to show you, nothing to tell you they're doing to work for the benefit of the Christian, the fellow Christians. For no one can live in peace without some understanding of what life really means. But nowadays, only Christians cling to a fantastic and worn-out creed as an explanation of why life is as it is and is not otherwise. Only Christians give the name of religion to a system which is not of the least use to anyone. Only among Christians is life separated from any or all doctrine and left without any definitive answer, whatever. Yeah. That's what you get. So he is showing you the darkest pit of hell that Christianity has fallen into by becoming Paulinist and by using Paul's doctrine of Romans 13, that the only real obedience left is to obey the state. And that's why you'll get socialism. That's why you're going to get communism. And you can't get out of it because we don't have a doctrine anymore of how to live and to offer anybody anything of substance to their life, because we don't have a construct of life anymore. All right, a couple more quotes. Where does that leave anyone? The state becomes the new religion. In other words, when Christians now say that Christianity is not about ethics but belief, and thereby anti-Christianity of the religious quality that Jesus also taught, besides belief, the masses have one choice left to have as their religion the obedience to the state's morality. This is the last condition of Christianity without Christ, in reliance upon Paul's dictum to obey rulers. He says, quote, now their faith is in what they are told to do. The faith of those who deny religion is in religion of obedience to the will of the ruling majority. In a word, submission is to established authority. Romans 13. Next quote. And thus believers in Christianity and skeptics end up with the same religion. Quote, ask the believers or skeptics of this age what doctrine of life they follow. They will be obliged to confess that they follow but one doctrine, the doctrine based upon laws formulated by the judiciary or by the legislative assemblies and enforced by the police, the favorite doctrine of most Europeans. See, he could see the death of Europe. Now, we live in America, and we're suffering the death later than Europe. Europe has been dead in this way since 1885 when he's talking. They're dead. They've been dead longer than we have. Now we're coming to the same death knell spiritually. And so his solution is to get back to the doctrines of Jesus. And it's coming. It has to, because European Western culture is collapsing because it doesn't have anything left. I mean, when the biggest and most important issue is pronouns, you just know there's nothing left. We have to make rules about pronouns now. Come on. That's all we have. That's the only ethics we have left. Okay. Let's just see. Well, we're almost done. So I'm gonna just read this straight through and without many more comments. Where does that leave anyone? The state becomes a new religion. Okay, no, I already got that one. And thus believers in Christianity and skeptics end up with the same religion. Ask the believers or skeptics of this age. No, okay, we got that. All right, here we go. Tolstoy says it is ironic that the only exception to these rules are a group of those resisting the current order and who continue the message of Christ but hate his name. He's talking about communists, I think. They hate his name because they confuse Christianity as it exists in the appalling deformed version today with the Christ version, which was founded by the true apostles. Tolstoy explains, quote, fortunately, there is a remnant made up of the noblest minds of the age who are not contented with this religion, but have an entirely different faith with regard to what the life of man ought to be. These men are looked upon as the most malevolent, the most dangerous, and generally as the most unbelieving of all human beings, and yet they are the only men of our time believing in the gospel doctrine, if not as a whole, or at least in part. He's talking about the communists, the radical left, the radical socialists. They're the only people who have a zeal to do good, and even if it's ruthless, okay? But they have morality. I mean, it's the irony of the age that the only people who have these kind of ethics anymore are the people who have no more belief in God, but believe in helping their fellow man. They've made a religion out of being good. The greatest example of that is a guy named Jimmy Dore on YouTube. He uses curse words every other word, but he wants to help the workers. He wants to help human beings, and he looks to me like a very genuine person in that regard. But the irony is that he holds very values in common with conservatives and other people who share values of trying to help the working man, help the poor. So he'll ally with and he puts it this way, I'll ally with anybody if they're willing to help the common man, help the working man. So here we're seeing exactly what Tolstoy was talking about. And these people have more zeal. They have more in touch with the gospel doctrine than Christians do. Do you see the point? Jesus could not be more clear in the sheep and the goats that we should be doing exactly what Jimmy Dore is trying to do for the homeless in downtown LA, and he profiles them. I just saw it today. He was profiling, the horror, or somebody was profiling today, the horror of the Los Angeles streets. They took a camera and they just went down street after street in downtown LA, and it looked like a third world nation. These people, as a general thing, know little of the doctrine of Jesus. That's Jimmy Dore. He doesn't know much of Jesus' doctrine, I bet, but they do not understand it. Often they have nothing but a hatred for the name of Jesus. Now, I don't know if that's true of Mr. Dore, but their whole faith with regard to what life ought to be is unconsciously based upon the humane and eternal truths comprised in the Christian doctrine. So Jimmy was probably raised with some Christian values, and he still holds on to those, but he won't. He's, I'm just judging by his cursing, using the F word a lot, but he believes in values towards people. He's not doing what he's doing for his own sake. He's trying to stir up people to help the poor and do good for the downtrodden masses, and he's not benefiting financially from it, and he's not running for political office. He's not trying to gain political power. He's trying to do something good for people. This remnant, in spite of calumny and persecution, are the only ones who do not tamely submit to the orders of the first comer. Consequently, they're the only ones in these days who live a reasonable and not an animal life, the only ones who have faith. That is so sad. That is so sad, my friends. And we have left the field. We have walked off the playing field. When you follow Paul, the church has followed Paul, and we've walked off the field of moral behavior. And I'm going to tell a story, and I'll never forget it. I was in an elders meeting at church, and we had the choice of going and preaching the gospel to a group of people at another church. And for some reason, it looked like we might not be able to get to that other church. And this is a church that believed in predestination that I belonged to at the time. And we weren't going to get there in time, or we might not go. And people were debating, should we even bother going? There's other people there, blah, blah, blah. And one of the elders said, well, you know what? We all believe in predestination. So whoever's going to get saved is going to get saved no matter what we do. So we don't have to go. So see how human doctrines get into your head, and predestination comes from Paul. So it's like, again, Paul always gives you an excuse not to do anything. So in essence, even though that was a specific instance, think about what predestination really does. It contaminates the mind. So we who are outside of Paul, we don't realize how Paulinists are trapped by predestination. If you don't do anything, it's not going to change anything, because if you preach the word, it won't save anybody that wouldn't have already been saved anyway. But they'll tell you, well, you never know. You never know if you're the tool that God planned to use for predestination. But the same token, you could say to yourself, well, if God predestined everything, then I'm going to get up and I'm going to talk to the right person at the right time to lead them to Christ. But you see, that doesn't really work. I mean, it works only in a world where you think everything is predestined. But what if the world isn't predestined? Then you don't know if something you could have said or done would have made a difference for somebody. And so this is where we've ended up, in the pit of hell, following Paul. And I'm talking the culture we live in, the Christian culture of today. And that's what Tolstoy put a diagnosis on it, of what Paulinism leads to. It's this complete departure from the field of true evangelism by doing the works that Christ told us to do, of taking it seriously, that these are things that we were commanded to do. Jesus said there's going to be the sheep and there's going to be the goats. The ones. Okay, so we'll go to the next paragraph. The necessity at this juncture is to consciously restore the doctrines of Jesus, which are unconsciously being followed by a dissenting but egalitarian movement. Tolstoy encourages us to abandon the church which is devoid of Christ's doctrines. Wow. Start completely over is basically what he's saying. Quote, the truth of the doctrine of Jesus, once unconsciously absorbed by humanity through the organism of the church, must now be consciously recognized. For in the truth of this doctrine, humanity has always obtained its vital force. Men must lift up the torch of truth, which has so long remained concealed, and carry it before them, guiding their actions by its light. The doctrine of Jesus as a religion that governs the actions of men and explains to them the meaning of life is now before the world just as it was 1800 years ago. Formerly, the world had the explanation of the church, which, in concealing the doctrine, seemed in itself to offer satisfactory interpretation of life. But now the time has come when the church has lost its usefulness, and the world, having no other means for sustaining its true existence, can only feel its helplessness and go for aid directly to the doctrine of Jesus. Tolstoy in the next chapter says, following just Jesus' doctrines is the path to happiness and salvation. Quote, I believe, and he put that in all caps, in the doctrine of Jesus, and this is my religion. I believe that nothing but the fulfillment of the doctrine of Jesus can give true happiness to men. I believe that the fulfillment of this doctrine is possible, easy, and pleasant. I believe that although none other follow this doctrine, and I am alone left to practice it, I cannot refuse to obey it if I would save my life from the certainty of eternal loss. Just as a man in a burning house, if he had found a door of safety, must go out, so I must avail myself of the way to salvation. I believe that my life according to the doctrine of the world has been a torment, and that a life according to the doctrine of Jesus can alone give me in this world the happiness for which I was destined by the Father of life. I believe that this doctrine is essential to the welfare of humanity, will save me from the certainty of eternal loss, and will give me in this world the greatest possible sum of happiness. Believing thus, I am obliged to practice its commandments. And so I say Tolstoy was the greatest modern proponent of what I call the Jesus words only principle. And just let me give you one last message. So this was a man who had become very, very rich. He had many, many serfs on his property. And he decided that he was going to obey Jesus and give all his money away, give all his wealth away, and even give up all the royalties to all his books and live in a little small shack on the land that he owned. And his wife was not so happy about this, by the way. And she went behind his back and she told the publishers, oh, he didn't really mean to give up his royalties to his books. So you still send the money to me. And Tolstoy apparently didn't either know what she was doing or basically looked the other way because his wife, it's his wife. What's he going to do? So my point is this: is he freed his serfs. He gave all his money away. He lived on a farm, with his wife. He stopped writing for a while, for a long time, and then eventually decided he would go back to writing just for the pleasure of it. And he did not live like a wealthy person. He lived like a pauper, is what he did in the end of life. He didn't beg. He didn't have to beg. His farm had enough food on it to live off of. But he definitely was living not high on the hog. He was sharing everything he had with the poor and living a totally different life, like his own little monastery, if you will. So he walked the walk. He totally walked the walk. And to him, giving up everything for eternal life was what was worth it. So I put him up there as number one. And did he put the diagnosis on our age or what? Paulinism destroyed Christianity. We're walking around as zombies and don't know it. We're living in a dead system. And what he's saying is basically each one of us individually must make the choice to turn away from the church systems that we're used to and turn to Christ and follow him and study his words. And that's it. Stop all this other nonsense of churchianity, Paulianity. All right. Hope that helped. And we have an example. Christ is our example. Number one, Tolstoy is another great example of somebody who lived by the example of Christ. All right, everybody, take care. God bless. Good night. Ciao. Bye.